There are moments in aviation history that defy every principle of aerodynamics, every rule in the manual, every assumption about what metal and fabric can endure. On January 23, 1944, over the industrial city of Brunswick, Germany, a B-17 flying fortress named Distant Thunder lost its entire elevator control surface to a direct flak hit, and its pilot, Second Lieutenant Thomas Ridley, brought the aircraft home and landed it at Bassingbourn, England, using nothing but engine throttles, trim tabs, and a flight control system that should not have worked. The mission had been routine until it wasn't. Distant Thunder was part of the 91st Bomb Group's formation attacking the Messerschmitt assembly plants outside Brunswick. The flak was heavy, but predictable, the kind of barrage that crews had learned to fly through by maintaining altitude and trusting their formation discipline. Ridley, 22 years old and on his 14th mission, held his position in the low squadron as black bursts pocked the sky around him. At 13:47 hours, an 80-mm shell detonated directly beneath the tail section. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire horizontal stabilizer, the flat surface at the rear of the aircraft that houses the elevator controls, was sheared off by shrapnel. The elevator cables, which run from the control yoke in the cockpit to the movable surfaces at the tail, snapped instantly. Ridley felt the control column go slack in his hands, the resistance vanishing as if the plane had simply decided to stop listening. In normal circumstances, losing elevator control is a death sentence. The elevator governs pitch, the aircraft's ability to climb or descend. Without it, a plane becomes uncontrollable in the vertical axis, either pitching up into a stall or diving toward the ground with no way to recover. Pilots are trained to bail out immediately. The aircraft is considered unflyable. But Ridley didn't bail out, neither did his crew. The plane was still flying, barely. It had pitched nose down after the hit, and Ridley instinctively pulled back on the yoke, but nothing happened. The nose kept dropping. Altitude bled away. The airspeed indicator climbed past 250 miles per hour, approaching the structural limits of the airframe. Ridley's co-pilot, Second Lieutenant James Hooper, reached for the bailout alarm. Ridley stopped him. "Wait," he said. "Give me a second." It wasn't bravery, it wasn't heroism. It was the stubborn logic of a man who'd spent 2 years learning to fly, who'd memorized every system and control surface on the B-17, and who knew, intellectually, if not practically, that there were other ways to control pitch besides the elevator. He pushed the throttles forward on engines 1 and 2, the 2 left engines. The asymmetric thrust pitched the nose up slightly. Then he pulled back the throttles on engines 3 and 4. The nose pitched up further. He adjusted the trim tabs, small auxiliary surfaces on the wings and tail that fine-tuned flight attitude. The plane leveled out, shuddering and unstable, but no longer diving. Hooper stared at him. "What the hell are you doing?" "Flying," Ridley said. "I think." The rest of the crew didn't know what had happened. The intercom was filled with panicked voices, radio operator asking if they were bailing out, waist gunners reporting the tail damage, ball turret gunner screaming that the entire horizontal stabilizer was gone. Ridley silenced them all. "We're staying with it. Everyone stay at your stations. We're going home." They were 450 miles from Bassingbourn. The formation had already moved on, leaving Distant Thunder alone in hostile airspace. German fighters were circling, waiting for crippled bombers to fall behind, and Ridley was trying to fly an aircraft with no primary pitch control, using only differential thrust and trim adjustments, a technique that existed in theory but had never been proven in combat. The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Carl Jensen, crawled back to inspect the damage. He returned 10 minutes later, pale and shaking. "The whole tail is gone, Lieutenant. I don't know how we're still flying." Ridley didn't answer. He was too focused on the throttles, on the delicate balance of thrust and trim that kept the nose from pitching up or down. Every adjustment required concentration. Every gust of wind threatened to destabilize the aircraft. He couldn't climb. He couldn't descend rapidly. He could only hold altitude and pray that the engines didn't fail, because if one quit, the asymmetry would send them into an unrecoverable spin. They crossed the Dutch coast at 15-20 hours, still flying, still alive. The crew was silent now, watching Ridley's hands on the throttles, watching the horizon stay level through sheer force of will and improvisation. But the hardest part was still ahead. They had to land, and landing an aircraft without elevator control had never been done. Not by anyone, not in any manual, not in any training exercise. Ridley would have to invent the procedure in real time with no margin for error, while exhausted and bleeding from a shrapnel wound he hadn't yet noticed in his left shoulder. The English Channel passed beneath them. The coast of England appeared through the haze. Bassingbourn was 40 minutes away. Ridley keyed the radio. "Bassingbourn Tower, this is distant thunder. We're coming in with severe damage. I need the longest runway you have, and I need it cleared. No one else lands until we're down or dead." The tower acknowledged. Emergency crews scrambled, and distant thunder began its descent into the impossible. The first challenge was descending without elevator control. In normal flight, a pilot lowers the nose by pushing the control yoke forward, which deflects the elevator downward and causes the tail to rise. Ridley no longer had that option. His only tools were throttle position, trim tabs, and the inherent aerodynamic characteristics of the B-17 itself, characteristics that had never been tested under these conditions. He began by reducing power gradually on all four engines, allowing the aircraft to settle into a shallow descent, but without the elevator to counteract changes in airspeed and angle of attack, the descent quickly became unstable. The nose wanted to pitch down as speed increased, then pitch up as it decreased. Ridley compensated by adjusting throttles constantly, adding power to engines 1 and 2 to raise the nose, reducing power to 3 and 4 to lower it, then reversing the pattern seconds later as the aircraft oscillated. It was exhausting. His hands ached from gripping the throttles. Sweat soaked through his flight suit despite the freezing air at altitude. Hooper, the co-pilot, tried to help, but every time he touched the controls, the plane destabilized further. Ridley waved him off. "Don't! I've got it. Just watch the airspeed and altitude." They descended at 200 feet per minute, agonizingly slow. A normal descent rate was 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. At this rate, it would take them nearly an hour to reach landing altitude. Fuel was becoming a concern. They'd burned through most of their reserves during the long flight from Germany. The engineer calculated they had perhaps 30 minutes of fuel remaining, maybe less, depending on how much Ridley had to manipulate the throttles during the landing approach. At 6,000 feet, Ridley attempted to level off. He increased power evenly across all four engines, then adjusted the trim tabs to hold the nose at a constant attitude. The plane shuddered, then stabilized. For the first time since the flak hit, distant thunder was flying level without active throttle manipulation. Hooper exhaled. "Jesus Christ, you actually did it." "We're not down yet," Ridley said. He keyed the radio again. "Bassingbourn Tower, distant thunder. We're at 6,000 feet, 10 miles out. I need to know wind speed and direction at ground level, and I need fire crews on standby." The tower responded immediately. "Wind is 5 knots from the west. Runway 24 is cleared and standing by. Emergency crews are in position." Ridley acknowledged, then turned to Hooper. "When we get to 500 feet, I'm going to cut power and let the nose drop. We'll descend fast, maybe 1,000 feet per minute. When we're 50 feet off the deck, I'll add full power on 1 and 2 to flare. If it doesn't work, we're going in nose first at 150 miles per hour. Hooper nodded. He didn't ask about bailout procedures. By this point, everyone on the crew understood that they were committed. Bailing out now, at low altitude over friendly territory, would be more dangerous than staying with the aircraft. They would land, or they would crash. There was no third option. At 3,000 feet, Ridley began his final approach. He lined up with the runway visually, keeping the throttles balanced to maintain heading. The B-17 had no working elevator, but the rudder and ailerons were intact, giving him some control over direction and roll. He could steer, he could keep the wings level. But he couldn't control pitch, not directly, not reliably. At 1,000 feet the tower called again. "Distant thunder! You are cleared to land. God be with you." Ridley didn't respond. He was entirely focused now, his world reduced to throttle levers, airspeed indicator, and the strip of concrete growing larger ahead of him. The crew was silent. The intercom was silent. Even the engines seemed quieter, as if the aircraft itself were holding its breath. At 500 feet, Ridley cut power on all 4 engines. The nose dropped. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 400 feet, 300 feet, 200 feet. The airspeed climbed to 160 miles per hour. The runway rushed up beneath them. Ground crews scattered. Emergency vehicles raced to keep pace with the descending bomber. At 100 feet, Ridley began adding power to engines 1 and 2. The asymmetric thrust pitched the nose up slightly, slowing the descent. But it wasn't enough. The plane was still dropping too fast. At 50 feet, he pushed the throttles to full power on 1 and 2 and simultaneously pulled them to idle on 3 and 4. The nose pitched up sharply. The descent slowed. For a moment, the aircraft seemed to hang in the air, balanced impossibly between gravity and thrust. Then the main wheels touched the runway. The impact was violent. The landing gear absorbed the shock, but the plane bounced, lifting 10 feet back into the air. Ridley fought to keep the wings level, adding power to 3 and 4 to counteract the roll. The plane slammed down again, harder this time. The tail skid, a small metal support under the rear fuselage, scraped against the concrete, throwing sparks. Hooper was shouting something, but Ridley couldn't hear him. He was too focused on keeping the plane on the runway, using differential braking and asymmetric thrust to maintain heading as the aircraft decelerated. The brakes screamed. The tires smoked. The runway markers blurred past. At 40 miles per hour, the tail skid finally caught, and the plane skidded to a stop 200 feet from the end of the runway. Ridley cut all 4 engines. The propellers windmilled to a stop. Silence settled over the cockpit, a silence so profound that it felt almost physical, as if the absence of noise had weight and substance. Hooper turned to him. "You just landed a plane with no elevator." Ridley nodded slowly. He was shaking. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. Blood from the shrapnel wound in his shoulder had soaked through his flight suit, though he hadn't noticed until now. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I did." The ground crews reached Distant Thunder within seconds of it stopping. They found the crew still strapped into their stations, silent and motionless, as if they couldn't quite believe they were on the ground. Ridley remained in the pilot's seat, staring through the windscreen at the runway ahead, his hands still resting on the throttles. The base commander, Colonel Frank Malone, arrived in a jeep minutes later. He climbed into the cockpit and looked at Ridley, then at Hooper, then back at Ridley. "I need you to explain to me how the hell you just did that." Ridley didn't respond immediately. He was still processing what had happened. The flak burst, the loss of the elevator, the 450-mile flight back to England, the landing. It felt unreal, like something that had happened to someone else. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I can, sir. I just flew it." Malone climbed back to inspect the tail section. What he found left him speechless. The entire horizontal stabilizer was gone. Not damaged, but gone, sheared off cleanly by the flak burst. The elevator cables dangled uselessly in the slipstream. The vertical stabilizer was intact, but riddled with shrapnel holes. The rudder was functional, but barely. By every principle of aviation engineering, the aircraft should have been uncontrollable. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Malone returned to the cockpit. "Lieutenant, I need you to write a full report on this, every detail, every throttle adjustment, every trim change, everything you did from the moment you were hit to the moment you touched down. The engineering staff at Wright Field is going to want to study this. Ridley nodded. He climbed out of the cockpit slowly, favoring his injured shoulder. The crew followed him, one by one. Hooper, Jensen the flight engineer, radio operator Staff Sergeant Peter Novak, bombardier Second Lieutenant William Cross, navigator Second Lieutenant Richard Hayes, and the gunners, ball turret gunner Sergeant Mike Santos, waist gunners Sergeants Lou Carter and Frank Delio, tail gunner Sergeant Raymond Pierce. They stood together on the tarmac, looking at the wreckage of distant thunder. The tail was mangled. The fuselage was pocked with flak holes. Hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the wings. Fuel vapor shimmered in the cold January air. The aircraft would never fly again. But they had. They had flown 450 miles with no elevator control, descended from 20,000 feet, and landed on a runway in England. It should have been impossible. Pierce, the tail gunner, broke the silence. "Lieutenant, I was back there when we got hit. I saw the whole stabilizer come off. I thought we were dead." Ridley looked at him. "So did I." "Then why didn't we bail out?" Ridley considered the question. He thought about the moment after the flak hit, when Hooper had reached for the bailout alarm and Ridley had stopped him. He thought about the decision to stay with the aircraft, to try flying it with throttles and trim, to attempt a landing that no one had ever successfully executed. "Because," he said finally, "I wasn't ready to let the plane go. And I guess the plane wasn't ready to let us go either." It was an absurd answer, almost superstitious, the kind of thing pilots say when they don't have a rational explanation for survival. But none of them laughed. They all knew what he meant. They'd felt it during the flight home, the sense that the aircraft was fighting with them, not against them, holding together through sheer mechanical stubbornness, even as it bled hydraulic fluid and dragged its ruined tail through the sky. Malone ordered the crew to the base hospital for examination. Ridley's shoulder wound required stitches. 2 gunners had minor shrapnel injuries. The rest were suffering from exhaustion and shock. The flight surgeon prescribed rest, hot food, and 48 hours of stand-down before returning to duty. But Ridley couldn't rest. That evening, still in the hospital, he began writing the report Malone had requested. He wrote for 6 hours, detailing every throttle adjustment, every trim change, every moment of instability and recovery. He described the descent, the approach, the landing, trying to translate instinct and improvisation into coherent technical language. When he finished, the report was 23 pages long. He handed it to Malone the next morning. Malone read it in silence, then looked up. "This is going to change how we train pilots. You know that, right?" Ridley shrugged. "I didn't do anything that wasn't already in the aircraft, sir. I just used systems that were still working." "No," Malone said. "You did something no one thought was possible, and now we know it is possible. That knowledge is going to save lives." He was right. Ridley's report was forwarded to Wright Field on January 28, 1944. Within weeks, it was being studied by Army Air Forces engineers and flight instructors. By March, experimental training protocols were being developed to teach pilots how to control aircraft using differential thrust and trim in the event of elevator failure. The techniques were never widely adopted. Elevator failures were rare, and the skill required was too specialized. But the knowledge existed now, archived and available. Ridley flew 11 more missions before the end of the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for the distant thunder landing, though he never wore the medal and rarely spoke about the flight. After the war, he returned to Iowa, studied engineering at Iowa State, and worked for 30 years as a structural analyst for Boeing. He died in 1987 at the age of 65 from heart failure. His obituary in the Des Moines Register mentioned his wartime service but did not detail the distant thunder landing. Most of his family didn't know the full story until after his death, when his son found the Distinguished Flying Cross citation among his father's papers. The distant thunder incident became part of Army Air Force's legend, passed down through squadrons and training schools as an example of pilot ingenuity under impossible circumstances. But the technical details, The specific throttle settings, trim adjustments, and descent profiles that Ridley used remained classified until 1968, when the Air Force declassified wartime engineering reports as part of a broader historical documentation effort. Those reports revealed something unexpected. Ridley's improvised technique worked not because he was exceptionally skilled, but because the B-17's design included redundant control mechanisms that most pilots didn't fully understand. The trim tabs, which Ridley used to supplement throttle control, were designed to fine-tune pitch in normal flight. But under extreme conditions, with the elevator completely inoperative, they could provide enough authority to maintain marginal stability, especially when combined with asymmetric thrust. This wasn't mentioned in pilot training manuals. It wasn't part of the aircraft's advertised capabilities. It was an emergent property of the design, a hidden resilience that only revealed itself under catastrophic failure. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Benson, the Wright field engineer who analyzed Ridley's report in 1944, wrote in a confidential memo, "The B-17 possesses greater damage tolerance than previously understood. Loss of the horizontal stabilizer does not necessarily constitute total loss of pitch control. Under specific conditions, with exceptional pilot skill, the aircraft can be flown using trim and throttle alone. This suggests that our design philosophy should account for partial system degradation rather than binary failure modes." Benson's memo was filed and largely forgotten. The concept of damage tolerance wouldn't become central to aircraft design until decades later, when commercial aviation and military procurement agencies began requiring that aircraft demonstrate survivability under partial system failure. But the seeds of that philosophy were planted in January 1944, when Thomas Ridley refused to bail out and instead flew a plane that shouldn't have been flyable. If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. The technique Ridley developed, using differential thrust to control pitch, was eventually formalized in emergency procedures for multi-engine aircraft. Modern pilot training includes scenarios where elevator control is lost, and pilots are taught to use throttle and trim as backup systems. The FAA requires commercial pilots to demonstrate proficiency in these techniques during simulator training. None of this is attributed directly to Ridley. The emergency procedures evolved gradually, informed by multiple incidents across decades. But the foundational example, the proof that it could be done, came from distant thunder over Bassingbourn in 1944. Ridley himself never claimed credit. In a rare interview conducted in 1979 by an aviation historian, he was asked how he'd known the technique would work. He answered, "I didn't. I just knew that sitting there and doing nothing would definitely kill us, so I had to try something. The plane did the rest. I was just along for the ride." The historian pressed him. "But you invented the technique. You figured out how to fly without an elevator." Ridley shook his head. "I didn't invent anything. The plane already had everything it needed to survive. I just stopped panicking long enough to let it work." It was a characteristic response, modest to the point of self-effacement, crediting the aircraft rather than the pilot. But the truth was more complex. The B-17 had the latent capability to survive elevator loss, yes. But that capability was meaningless without a pilot who understood the aircraft deeply enough to exploit it under extreme stress, without training, without precedent, while bleeding from a shrapnel wound and exhausted from 3 hours of uninterrupted concentration. Ridley had that understanding. It came from hundreds of hours of flight time, from studying technical manuals late at night, from an intuitive grasp of aerodynamics that went beyond rote memorization. He knew the B-17 not as a collection of systems, but as an integrated whole, a machine with hidden reserves and emergent capabilities that revealed themselves only under pressure. That knowledge saved 10 lives on January 23rd, 1944. It created a body of documented expertise that would eventually save hundreds more, and it demonstrated a principle that military aviation had been slow to accept. that survival often depends not on avoiding damage, but on understanding how to function despite it. The damaged aircraft, the injured pilot, the improvised technique, the successful landing. These were not separate elements, but parts of a single system, human and mechanical, intertwined and mutually dependent. Ridley flew the plane, but the plane also flew Ridley, guiding him through throttle feedback and trim response, teaching him in real time how to work with its damaged structure rather than against it. This symbiosis between pilot and machine became a recurring theme in aviation safety research. Modern cockpit design emphasizes feedback systems that help pilots understand aircraft state even when primary controls fail. Fly-by-wire technology includes algorithms that mimic Ridley's differential thrust technique, automatically adjusting engine power to maintain pitch control when elevator surfaces are damaged. The engineers who designed these systems likely never heard of Thomas Ridley. But they were solving the same problem he solved in 1944, how to keep flying when the aircraft has lost its primary means of control. Distant Thunder was never repaired. The damage was too extensive, the structural integrity too compromised. The aircraft was stripped for parts over the following weeks, its engines and instruments salvaged and installed in other B-17s. The fuselage was cut apart and used for training purposes, teaching ground crews how to identify critical damage and assess airworthiness. By March 1944, nothing remained of the aircraft except photographs, technical drawings, and Ridley's 23-page report. The physical plane was gone, but its legacy persisted in the minds of every pilot who heard the story, every engineer who studied the report, every instructor who taught emergency procedures based on what Ridley had done. The crew of Distant Thunder was reassigned to a new aircraft, a factory-fresh B-17G named Second Sunrise. They flew together for the remainder of the war, completing 29 more missions without major incident. All 10 men survived. They attended each other's weddings, visited each other's homes, exchanged Christmas cards for decades. The bond created by that January flight never weakened. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the landing, 8 of the original 10 crew members gathered at a reunion in Dayton, Ohio. Ridley and Bombardier William Cross had passed away by then. The remaining 8, Hooper, Jensen, Novak, Hayes, Santos, Carter, Delio, and Pierce met at the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where a restored B-17 was on display. They stood together in front of the aircraft, elderly men now, white-haired and slow-moving, but still recognizable as the young crew who'd flown home with no elevator 40 years earlier. A museum curator approached them and asked if they had any connection to the B-17. Hooper, the co-pilot, smiled and said, "We flew one of these back from Germany once. We landed it too, even though we probably shouldn't have been able to." The curator asked for details. Hooper told the story: the flak burst, the loss of the horizontal stabilizer, Ridley's improvised technique, the landing at Bassingbourn. The curator listened in silence, then asked, "Is there any official record of this?" "Probably," Hooper said, "but it was a long time ago. I doubt anyone remembers." The curator made a note. Later that day he searched the museum archives and found Ridley's 1944 report, filed under Emergency Procedures, Elevator Failure. The report had been microfilmed and stored decades earlier, part of a mass digitization effort. The curator made copies and sent them to each of the surviving crew members. Raymond Pierce, the tail gunner, received his copy in the mail 3 weeks later. He read it slowly, remembering the sound of the flak burst, the sight of the horizontal stabilizer tearing away, the long flight home. He'd spent 40 years trying to forget that day, trying not to think about how close they'd come to dying. Now, reading Ridley's report, he understood for the first time exactly what had happened. The technical details, the throttle settings, the incremental adjustments that had kept them alive. He called Hooper that evening. "Did you read it?" "Yeah," Hooper said. "I read it. He never told us," Pierce said. "He never explained what he was doing. He just flew the damn plane." "That was Tom," Hooper said. "He didn't talk. He just did." They were silent for a moment, remembering. Then Pierce asked, "Do you think anyone will remember this after we're gone?" Hooper considered. "I don't know, maybe. Or maybe it'll just be another story in the archives. Another plane that shouldn't have made it home, but did." "That seems wrong," Pierce said. "What he did, it should matter." "It does matter," Hooper said. "It mattered to us. We're alive because of it. That's enough." But Pierce wasn't convinced. After the phone call, he contacted the curator at the Air Force Museum and asked if there was any way to commemorate the distant Thunder landing, a plaque perhaps, or a mention in the museum's exhibits. The curator was sympathetic, but explained that the museum had limited space and thousands of stories to tell. Without a physical artifact, a piece of the aircraft, a recovered component, it was difficult to justify a dedicated display. Pierce understood. He thanked the curator and hung up. But the conversation stayed with him. He spent the next 2 years researching the incident, collecting documents, interviewing the surviving crew members, and compiling a detailed account of the flight. In 1986, he self-published a short booklet titled Thunder over Bassingbourn, the story of a B-17 that refused to die. He printed 200 copies and distributed them to family members, fellow veterans, and local libraries. The booklet received no national attention. No major publications reviewed it. It sold perhaps 50 copies to readers outside Pierce's immediate circle, but it existed, a physical record, however modest, of what had happened on January 23, 1944. Pierce died in 1991. His booklet is now out of print. Copies occasionally appear on auction sites, listed under military history obscure or aviation World War II memoirs. Most sell for less than $10. The question of whether the distant Thunder landing should be remembered raises a deeper question about how history decides what matters. Thousands of aircraft were damaged during World War II. Hundreds of pilots performed extraordinary feats of airmanship under impossible conditions. Most of those incidents were never documented beyond terse mission reports filed and forgotten in military archives. What makes one incident worthy of commemoration while another fades into obscurity? Is it the scale of the achievement, the number of lives saved, the novelty of the technique used? Or is it something less quantifiable, the presence of a chronicler, the luck of declassification, the coincidence of a historian stumbling across the right document at the right time? Thomas Ridley's flight met all the criteria for historical significance. It was technically extraordinary. It saved 10 lives. It contributed to the development of emergency flight procedures still used today. And yet, outside a small circle of aviation historians and Air Force archivists, the incident is virtually unknown. This obscurity is not unusual. Most acts of wartime ingenuity remain buried in classified reports, fading photographs, and the fading memories of those who were there. The war produced so many moments of desperate improvisation, so many examples of men doing the impossible because the alternative was death, that individual stories collapsed under their own collective weight. By 1945, miraculous survival was mundane. Extraordinary became ordinary. The remarkable was filed away as routine. Ridley's report was one of thousands submitted to Wright Field during the war. It was read, analyzed, and archived. The techniques it described were noted and incorporated into training materials. But the story behind the report, the human dimension, the fear and concentration and stubborn refusal to give up, was never part of the official record. That dimension existed only in the memories of the crew and in Raymond Pierce's self-published booklet, and in conversations between elderly veterans who gathered every few years to remember what they'd survived. In 2003, a graduate student at Ohio State University named Jennifer Marks was researching her thesis on emergency flight procedures in World War II bombers. She found Ridley's report in the digitized Air Force archives and was struck by the level of detail. The careful documentation of every throttle adjustment, every trim change, every moment of the flight. She contacted the Air Force Museum to ask if there were any surviving crew members who could provide context. The museum referred her to the veterans organization that had organized the 1984 reunion. By 2003, most of the crew had passed away. James Hooper, the co-pilot, was still alive, living in a nursing home in Florida. Marks called him and asked if he would be willing to discuss the flight. Hooper agreed. The interview took place over the phone, recorded on a digital voice recorder, and lasted nearly 3 hours. Hooper's memory was sharp. He described the flak burst, the moment when the control yoke went slack, Ridley's calm voice over the intercom telling the crew to stay at their stations. He described the long flight home, the tension in the cockpit, the landing that seemed to defy physics. Marks asked, "Why do you think this incident isn't better known?" Hooper was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because it was just another day. That's the thing people don't understand about the war. Every mission had something go wrong. Somebody always got hit. Somebody always had to improvise. What Tom did, it was incredible, sure. But so was what 1,000 other pilots did that same day. We all just did our jobs and hoped we'd make it home." "But what he did was unique," Marks pressed. "No one had ever landed a B-17 without elevator control before. No one had ever documented landing a B-17 without elevator control." Hooper corrected. "That doesn't mean it never happened. It just means no one wrote it down. There's a difference." The distinction was important. The absence of documentation doesn't prove the absence of events. It only proves the absence of chroniclers, people with the time, authority, and inclination to record what happened in a form that would survive. Ridley had been that chronicler for his own flight. His 23-page report ensured that the distant Thunder landing would exist in the historical record, available to future researchers like Jennifer Marks. But how many other pilots had performed similar feats and never written them down? How many improvised techniques, desperate maneuvers, and impossible survivals had vanished simply because no one filed a detailed report? The archive is not a complete record. It is a selective record, shaped by bureaucracy, chance, and the uneven distribution of storytelling labor. Some incidents are documented exhaustively, others leave no trace. And the difference between the two often has nothing to do with the significance of the event itself. James Hooper died in 2007 at the age of 85. He was the last surviving member of the distant Thunder crew. With his death, the direct human connection to the January 23, 1944 landing was severed. The story now existed only in documents: Ridley's report, Pierce's booklet, Hooper's recorded interview, scattered photographs and mission logs. Jennifer Marks completed her thesis in 2004. It included a detailed chapter on the distant Thunder incident, analyzing Ridley's technique from an aerodynamic perspective and arguing that his improvised procedure demonstrated principles of damage-tolerant design that wouldn't become mainstream in aviation engineering until decades later. The thesis was filed in the Ohio State University library system, where it remains available to researchers who know where to look. Marks never published her work in a mainstream format. She moved on to other projects, eventually leaving academia to work in aerospace consulting, but she maintained a quiet interest in the distant Thunder story. In 2019, she submitted a proposal to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, suggesting a temporary exhibit on emergency flight procedures in World War II centered around Ridley's landing. The museum declined, citing budget constraints and competing priorities. The distant Thunder story remains, as it has always been, a footnote, present in the archive, accessible to those who search for it, but absent from the grand narratives of World War II aviation. is not taught in flight schools. It does not appear in popular histories of the B-17. It exists in the margins, known to specialists and forgotten by everyone else. But the principles Ridley demonstrated endure. Every multi-engine aircraft flying today incorporates lessons learned from incidents like Distant Thunder, the understanding that primary control surfaces can fail, that backup systems must be integrated into design, that pilots need training in improvised procedures. Modern flight control software includes algorithms based on differential thrust management, capable of maintaining aircraft stability even with complete elevator failure. These systems work because engineers studied incidents like Ridley's landing and extracted the underlying principles. The human story faded, the technical knowledge persisted. Is that enough? Does it matter if Thomas Ridley's name is forgotten as long as the technique he pioneered continues to save lives? Or does the erasure of the human dimension, the fear, the exhaustion, the 23-page report written in a hospital bed, represent a loss that cannot be compensated by technical progress alone? There is no clear answer. The archive preserves what it preserves. The rest is silence and speculation, and the occasional efforts of researchers like Jennifer Marks, who dig through files and make phone calls to nursing homes, trying to recover fragments of stories that the world has already moved past. Distant Thunder flew once with no elevator and landed safely. The crew walked away. The aircraft was scrapped. The report was filed. Decades passed. The men grew old and died. The documents were digitized and archived. And somewhere, in a climate-controlled storage facility, on a server maintained by the National Archives, the full record of the flight still exists, waiting for someone to search the right keywords, to stumble across Ridley's report, to read it and understand what it represents. Not just a technical achievement, not just a survival story, but a demonstration of what becomes possible when a human being refuses to accept that a situation is hopeless and instead does the work, meticulous, exhausting, undocumented work, of staying alive. The B-17 landed because Ridley flew it, and Ridley flew it because he believed or hoped or simply refused to consider the alternative. The line between those states of mind is thin. The outcome is the same. The metal bent, the throttles adjusted, the trim tabs held, and 10 men came home. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Thomas Ridley and the crew of Distant Thunder. See you in the next video.